Grace Morgan had always known that land didn't just sit quietly under your feet. It spoke, if you listened. The soil held memory, tension, resistance. It carried the pressure of seasons, of boots, of storms. Her father had told her that once in the early morning haze of calving season, when her hands were small and her boots too big. He hadn't been the kind of man to speak often or fondly, but when he did, he spoke of the land the way others spoke of God, with reverence and an unshakable understanding that it owed you nothing. When he died, Grace buried him in the northeast field, under a cedar that had long outlived every fence post around it. She never put up a headstone. Just a split rail and a rusted horseshoe nailed to the trunk. The land remembers, she thought. That was enough. Now, at 35, Grace lived alone on the same ranch, 800 acres of broken hills, stubborn brush, and one of the last undeveloped ridgelines in the county. The house was old but solid. The fences were patched. The water lines worked because she knew every joint and coupling by hand. She made her income through specialty agriculture contracts, selling native seeds and cultivating a heritage breed of black-footed chickens that she guarded like diamonds. The ranch wasn't romantic, and it damn sure wasn't profitable in the way people like to see in a spreadsheet, but it was hers, and it functioned like a closed system. Not lean-to or rustic, but tuned like an engine, one built from inherited knowledge, not blueprints. So, when a polished black Escalade came creeping up her gravel drive in the middle of planting season, kicking up a line of dust that lingered in the still spring air, Grace knew something was wrong before the tires even stopped turning. No one came up that drive without a reason. Tourists got lost once in a while, or drifters mistook her barn's silhouette for a roadside antique stop, but this wasn't that. The car didn't hesitate. It turned in like it had directions. Grace wiped her hands on a towel, not out of courtesy but to avoid transferring soil onto her doorknob as she stepped off the porch. The woman who stepped out was dressed in an expensively casual linen suit, the kind that suggested she had enough money to pretend she didn't care. Her shoes weren't dusty. Her smile was bright, practiced, and mildly aggressive, like someone trying to upsell you on a luxury upgrade you didn't ask for. She held a folio under one arm, the kind lawyers or realtors carried. Grace didn't speak first. She waited. "Grace Morgan?" the woman asked, her voice syrupy and strong, rehearsed to cut through wind or reluctance. "I'm Karen Ellsworth. I'm organizing my daughter's wedding this spring, and we've been searching for the perfect location. Quiet, scenic, something authentic. You can imagine how hard that is these days. Everything's either fake rustic or just neglected. But your property, it's stunning." Grace looked her over once, then glanced past her toward the ridgeline. "It's not for sale." Karen laughed lightly with the kind of chuckle that usually accompanied dismissing the help. "Oh, I'm not looking to buy it. Of course not. I just want to use it. One day, maybe two with setup. The wedding, the reception, everything in one place. We'll bring everything in, and we'll leave it exactly as we found it. I'll pay you, obviously." "Very well. You won't even have to lift a finger." Grace raised an eyebrow. "It's not an event venue. It's a working ranch." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her tone shifted by a hair. "Well, technically, under county zoning, agricultural land can be used for cultural events. We've already cleared that. We just need your consent. My team would handle the logistics. Think of it as a donation to beauty, to joy. My daughter, she's dreamed of a wedding like this her whole life. Simple, elegant, natural, nothing artificial." Grace crossed her arms. "Then she should get married in her own backyard." Karen blinked. For a moment her veneer slipped, and what peeked through was a glint of steel, entitlement, the muscle memory of never being told no. "You're being difficult," she said, and then corrected herself. "I mean, you're missing an opportunity. This isn't just about money, it's about legacy, community. You could be part of something beautiful." "I already am," Grace said evenly and turned to go back inside. She didn't slam the door. She didn't have to. Karen didn't leave immediately. She stood in the driveway for another minute, looking around with narrowed eyes, likely calculating how hard it would be to work around resistance. Grace watched her through the kitchen window as she finally drove off. The dust didn't settle for a long time. A week later, Grace found white flags staked into the western pasture, bright plastic markers labeled with letters and arrows. Someone had walked her land and marked locations for tents or stages or God knows what. She pulled them up, one by one, tossed them into the bed of her truck, and called the sheriff's office. The deputy who came out was young, polite, and entirely useless. Said it was probably just a misunderstanding, suggested it might be the county survey crew, offered to file a report, but not much else. The next day, a crew truck rolled up before dawn and parked just outside the gate. Grace, already up and feeding the hens, watched as 3 men got out and began unloading staging poles and crates labeled lighting. She approached, asked who had sent them. One shrugged. Event contractor. Address matched. We've got a permit. No, you don't, she said, stepping between them and the gate. The foreman pulled out a folded paper, clearly a copy, not an original. It referenced a temporary use license, but the parcel ID didn't match hers. She pointed it out. The man frowned, double-checked, and cursed under his breath. We'll call it in, he said, and they packed up slowly, obviously annoyed. By the time Grace got to the county office the next morning, her file had already been updated. There was, somehow, a pending application under her property's name for a single-day wedding event, with a setup period of 48 hours and full rights for audio, catering, and drone coverage. It had been submitted using a limited-use access agreement through a proxy applicant. The staffer at the front desk couldn't tell her who submitted it, only that it was in process. Grace didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She asked for a copy of every document on file, paid for the printing, and drove straight to her lawyer, a bulldog who usually handled water rights and once sued the county over gravel road maintenance and won. He read the papers twice, rubbed his temples, and asked, "Did you piss off someone rich lately?" "Maybe," she said, and gave him Karen Ellsworth's name. He nodded slowly. "Okay, then we fight this like they're already 10 steps ahead. Because they are." Grace didn't return home that night. She stayed with a friend outside town, let the ranch sit dark and empty, a tactic to buy time and see if anyone took advantage. No one did, but when she returned the next morning, a fresh set of tire tracks cut across the back road. Someone had driven in through the service entrance, made a wide loop around the ridge, and left. Grace stood for a long time in the middle of the field, hands in her jacket pockets, wind picking up her hair like strands of old wire. The land, she thought, always tells you when something's wrong. You just have to know how to listen, and this land was getting loud. The rain that fell 3 days later didn't bring relief. It came down in sheeting gusts that peeled back loose shingles and turned the clay road into a slick, ochre-colored slide. Grace stood by the barn door, watching water curl through the wheel ruts and snake across her gravel like veins through stone. It wasn't the kind of rain that made you stop and appreciate the view. It was the kind that made you check your boundaries. And when it finally stopped that night, she did exactly that. She found footprints along the south fence just past the old grain silo. Not boots like hers, but flat-soled shoes, city-made with clean lines and no grip. Useless in wet pasture, but still there, one after another, as if whoever had walked there didn't care how much noise they made or how far the mud sucked at their heels. That told Grace something. Someone had come through again, maybe to scout, maybe to test her visibility. Either way, it meant escalation. No one walks past a no trespassing sign with dry intentions. They step over it because they believe the rules don't apply to them. The following morning, the mail carrier left more than just bills. A certified envelope was clipped to the gate with a bright orange tag. Signature waived. Received under protest. That was the first red flag. Grace opened it at the kitchen table with her pocket knife, sliding the blade through the glued seam like she was dressing a deer. Inside were neatly stacked papers, professionally typeset, notary stamped, and dated 2 days prior. It was a formal notice of temporary easement request approval, allegedly signed by Grace Morgan. She stared at the signature. It was hers, or someone's version of it. Not traced, but copied, stylized in a way that only someone with an old document or scan would be able to fake. She hadn't signed anything, not a lease, not a waiver, not a form. The rage didn't come fast. It arrived like the storm. Slow, building, undeniable. Her hand clenched the corner of the paper, but she didn't crumple it. She would need it intact. Instead, she walked it back to the truck, drove into town, and handed the envelope directly to her lawyer without a word. He read it, then again slower, and finally exhaled through his nose like he was blowing out smoke he hadn't meant to inhale. "That's a forged authorization," he said flatly. "It's not even clever. But it's been filed, and if we don't counter it immediately, the county will assume silence is consent. We've got maybe 48 hours to freeze it." Grace didn't nod. She didn't blink. She just said, "Do it." He was already on the phone before she closed the door. By sunset, Grace was back at the ranch with a printed packet of the forged submission. She studied every page, every clause, every alleged initial. Someone had reconstructed her signature from old paperwork. Maybe a scanned copy of the deed transfer after her father passed. Maybe something from the Agricultural Board when she registered for erosion credits. Either way, it meant someone had access, and access meant planning. This wasn't some entitled woman throwing tantrums. It was a coordinated maneuver. Someone had gone through the system, found the crack, and slid the whole damn thing through it. 2 days later, 3 trucks arrived. Not construction this time. Catering rigs, white and polished with vinyl logos of luxury event firms from Austin and Dallas. They lined up along the access road, their engines idling, waiting for a signal that never came. Grace stood by the gate in a raincoat, shotgun in one hand, phone in the other, live calling her lawyer on speaker. The lead caterer, a man in a tailored vest and a Bluetooth headset, approached with confident stride and a clipboard. "You must be Miss Morgan," he said, looking down at the paper. "We're here for the pre-event layout. Just staging today, no deliveries." Grace didn't answer. Her lawyer did. "Sir, you are trespassing. The documents you are holding are subject to legal dispute and have not been executed by the landowner. I suggest you vacate the premises immediately before I add your company to the injunction filing going out tomorrow morning." The caterer's face twitched, just a fraction. Then he turned around and called something to the others in Spanish. Within minutes, the trucks turned and pulled away, but not in a panic, just with irritation. They weren't embarrassed. They were used to operating in gray areas, used to assuming that money fixed discomfort. By then, the damage was visible. Ruts from tires had cut into her fireline trench, crushed the dormant irrigation line that hadn't been flagged. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was deliberate. The message was simple. We can come through here any time. That night, Grace reinforced every gate with chain locks, laid down spikes she used during calving season to block coyotes, and set up motion sensor lights on the rear entrance. She wasn't preparing for war. She was preparing for fatigue. These people wouldn't come through once. They'd come through every week until she broke, until it seemed easier to say yes. But Grace had seen this kind of pressure before. When her father was dying, the bank had offered to restructure the property. Code for subdivide and sell. When the storms hit 2 summers in a row and her backup tanks failed, the county had threatened fines for mismanagement, until she showed them receipts proving the leak was on their line. People with power didn't always attack. They suffocated, slowly, bureaucratically, and the only way to survive it was to outlast them, minute by minute, step by step. That weekend, she found a pair of surveyors near the north fence. They had permits, maps, reflective vests. Everything looked official, until she saw that the boundary lines on their tablets included a section of her ridge that had never been part of any zoning change. She asked who hired them. One said a name she didn't recognize. The other mumbled, "Event Logistics." Grace didn't argue. She called the sheriff, reported illegal surveying, and photographed everything. When the deputy came, he asked if they had left already. "No," she said. "They're sitting in the truck pretending they're on break." He nodded, wrote a warning, and escorted them off the land. But the men smiled as they left, like they'd already logged the data they needed. Grace drove to the county office herself Monday morning and sat in the Land Records Division until she got a copy of every recent permit pulled within 5 miles of her parcel. 3 names came up consistently. 2 were shell companies registered to P.O. boxes. The third was Ellsworth Weddings, Inc. She didn't go home after that. She went straight to the Regional Agriculture Bureau and filed a formal complaint citing fraudulent representation of agricultural land for commercial events. The complaint triggered an automatic pause on all related permits for 30 days. It wasn't a win. It was breathing room. When she returned to the ranch that night, there was a package leaning against her front door. No postage, just a white box wrapped with a bow. Inside was a bottle of champagne and a note printed in silver ink. "Let's work together. This can be beautiful. K." Grace didn't throw it. She didn't rage. She poured the champagne into the sink, set the bottle on the porch rail, and left the note inside her lawyer's next evidence envelope. The message was clear. They weren't done. They weren't even winded. But Grace wasn't either. And they'd made a mistake. They assumed a woman on land alone was land waiting to be claimed. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Grace didn't sleep the night after the champagne box appeared. Not because she was afraid. Fear was an impulse long since domesticated in her, but because her mind wouldn't stop cataloging. Every document she had gathered now formed a lattice in her brain. The forged signature, the false boundary lines, the overlapping event permits with incorrect parcel IDs, the bogus easement request. All of it had the feel of something coordinated, not improvised. This wasn't Karen acting alone out of entitlement or vanity. This was infrastructure. Someone with knowledge of zoning codes and administrative loopholes was pulling strings, and Karen Ellsworth had the resources to hire those kinds of people. Grace had seen this method before, not in weddings or real estate, but in agricultural buyouts when conglomerates moved into rural towns under the pretense of revitalization. They didn't negotiate. They anticipated surrender, and when they didn't get it, they changed tactics. So she began building a strategy that didn't rely on confrontation or courtroom drama. It relied on time, on endurance, and on creating a situation so inconvenient and legally sound that it would be more costly for them to continue than to leave her alone. The first real escalation came 4 days later, when the power flickered off during an irrigation cycle and didn't come back. At first, she assumed it was a grid outage. Texas spring storms weren't known for their restraint, but a quick check online showed no reported blackouts in the area. Grace grabbed her flashlight and headed down to the generator shed near the southeast fence. It was padlocked, like always, but the lock had been cut and replaced with a different one. Newer, shinier, untouched by rain or time. Someone had gotten in, swapped the lock to delay access, and likely tampered with the controls. She broke the new lock with bolt cutters and found the kill switch flipped. No damage, no theft, just a message. "We can touch this too." She turned it back on, rebooted the system, and documented everything. Then she installed a trail camera disguised as a birdhouse in the closest cedar tree. That same afternoon, 2 white vans pulled up to the northern road without warning. A crew of men in matching polos emerged, carrying what appeared to be lighting rigs and foldable staging equipment. They began unloading without asking. Grace intercepted the man in charge, who introduced himself as the site coordinator. He had the casual aggression of someone used to steamrolling complaints with practiced civility. She asked if he had a permit. He said he didn't need one. The event planner already handled it. When Grace informed him that all permits on the property were currently frozen by legal action, he smiled and said, "Then we'll wait for the ruling. In the meantime, this is preparatory work, not structural. It's not regulated." She called the sheriff's office. The same deputy from before arrived, friendly but visibly uncomfortable. He read through the documents again, scratched his neck, and muttered, "It's all in limbo, ma'am. Technically, they're not constructing anything permanent." "Not yet." Grace looked him square in the face and asked, "Would you let someone set up a barbecue in your backyard because they say they might have permission later?" He shifted awkwardly and said he'd issue a general disturbance warning. The crew packed up reluctantly, their leader smiling like someone who'd be back the next morning. Grace realized then that her legal filings were only slowing them down. They needed something else, something loud, something that made this land not just resistant to use, but utterly undesirable for their purpose. That night, while pacing the gravel with a thermos in hand, she thought of the old mud bog rallies that used to take place near the state line. Wild, noisy events with off-road vehicles tearing through swampy terrain, turning pastures into chaotic trails of churned earth and wet craters. A festival of controlled chaos, entirely legal on private property. The kind of event no wedding would survive near. She opened her laptop and began drafting a notice. Mud Bog Rally. Open invite. Private land, one-day event. Bring your rig, bring your own water, zero tolerance for drama. Saturday. She posted it on 3 off-road forums she knew from back in her agricultural networking days. The responses came fast and heavy. Dozens of enthusiasts tagging each other asking for location, terrain type, elevation, legal status. Grace responded to each. No entry fee, no services, just terrain. By morning, 50 RSVPs had stacked up. By noon, it was over 100. Karen must have gotten word of it by the end of the day because the next morning, a letter arrived via a courier. Not mail. It was thick, printed on heavy stock, and began with, "It is with great disappointment that I learned of your intention to disrupt the long-planned and deeply meaningful wedding of my daughter with an event designed solely to provoke." It went on for 3 pages, each line a passive-aggressive attempt at guilt, warning, or veiled threat. Grace scanned it once, then folded it and placed it neatly in her file box labeled Leverage. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The land would respond for her. The days leading up to the rally were busy. She didn't rest. She marked off danger zones, put up flags where water ran deepest, and mapped a basic loop through the south field that led uphill past the old hay barn and back around through a natural basin that would, if the rain kept up, turn into a perfect mud. Pete. Volunteers began showing up early, guys in lifted trucks with sunburnt arms and metal coolers in their beds. They helped set up markers, haul debris out of the path, and dig runoff trenches. No one asked for anything in return. They were here for the thrill, and the fact that it pissed off someone rich made it even better. On Friday night, the eve of the so-called wedding, the land transformed. Grace stood at the highest point of the ridge and watched headlights snake up the access road. The field below flickered with campfires and mobile rigs. Generators hummed. Laughter echoed between hills. It was messy and unpredictable and absolutely perfect. And most importantly, it was all legal. Karen showed up just after sunrise the next day. She came in a white Mercedes SUV, flanked by 2 assistants and 1 man who looked like private security. She didn't park. She drove directly to the gate and waited. Grace approached calmly, clipboard in hand. Karen didn't roll down the window. She opened the door and stepped out in suede heels, looked around at the mud tracks and parked off-road vehicles and sneered. "This is your plan? Some backwoods circus?" Grace didn't answer. Karen gestured toward the field. Do you have any idea how much money you're costing us? How many vendors are en route right now? You think this is clever?" Grace flipped the clipboard around and handed it to her. "Event notice, registered with the county, private event, agricultural land use, fully compliant, no violation." Karen didn't take it. She stood stiff, shaking. "This is vandalism," she hissed, "and I will sue you into the dirt you're playing in." Grace smiled, not out of malice, but out of certainty. "Get in line." By mid-morning, the field was a thundering mess of tires and mud. Engines roared, flags waved, people whooped and cheered as vehicles fishtailed through slick turns and plowed up inclines. The wedding crew never arrived. Or, if they did, they turned around the moment they saw the chaos. The sky stayed dry, but the ground didn't need help. Every turn of the wheel made the field less salvageable for any ceremony. By sunset, the place looked like a war zone, and everyone was smiling. That night, as bonfires burned and music blasted from pickup speakers, Grace sat on the porch with a beer in hand. She didn't celebrate. She reflected. This wasn't the end. Karen would come back, maybe not with planners but with lawyers and invoices and dramatics. But now, Grace had precedent. She had made the land incompatible with their fantasy. She had shown what real use looked like. And she wasn't done yet. The Monday after the rally was silent. Not the peaceful, restorative kind, but the unnaturally still kind that settles after disruption, like smoke after a shot has been fired. Grace walked the property at sunrise, her boots sinking slightly into the churned soil. The ground was a torn battlefield of tire tracks, puddled clay, and dislodged rocks. It looked like hell, and it was exactly what she needed. The mud had spoken in a language that even bureaucrats could not sanitize. This land was not a wedding venue, not a backdrop for curated joy. It was volatile, alive and unwilling to bend to ornamental fantasies. But even as she surveyed the wreckage with grim satisfaction, Grace knew it wasn't over. A response would come. And it wouldn't be subtle. It arrived in the form of a letter slid under her door with no envelope and no stamp. Typed, unsigned, just one paragraph long. "You have made your intentions clear. So have we. Prepare for legal remedy." That was it. No names, no threats, no contact information. Just a declaration, calculated, cold, and devoid of the ego that had once characterized Karen's earlier communication. This was no longer about pride or reputation. This had become strategic. It meant someone else had taken the reins. The lawyers were in control now. Grace took the note and added it to her file without ceremony. She knew the rhythm of escalation, had danced with it in other forms. What she needed now was not a bigger move, but a smarter one. She couldn't keep repelling them by sheer force. They would adapt, reframe her resistance as aggression, spin it into noncompliance or obstruction. So she made a shift, not in purpose but in optics. She contacted the local Soil and Water Conservation Board and requested an inspection of post-event terrain impact. She wasn't looking to cover her tracks. She was making them official. The inspector arrived 2 days later, a soft-spoken man with a clipboard and boots too clean for his profession. Grace showed him the rally route, pointed out erosion markers, highlighted where runoff had been redirected to avoid flooding the chicken coops. He took notes, asked few questions, and left without comment. 3 days later, she received the report. No violations. In fact, the use of temporary mud bogging on agricultural land had actually aerated the soil in several zones, increasing native seed dispersal and reducing compaction from previous overgrazing. The irony made her smile. They hadn't just failed to stop her, they'd accidentally helped improve her land. Still, pressure mounted elsewhere. Vendors from the would-be wedding began contacting her, some politely, others with veiled contempt. One demanded reimbursement for transport costs. Another accused her of sabotage and threatened social media exposure. Grace ignored them all. She had documented every step, every permit, every posted warning. Her lawyer confirmed that she was not liable for contracts she hadn't signed or events she hadn't agreed to host. But the steady drumbeat of complaints had its intended effect. It drained energy, sowed doubt, chipped at resolve. That was the tactic now. Not one decisive strike, but 1,000 tiny cuts. Bureaucracy as weaponry. A week passed before Karen resurfaced, this time not in person, but via a formal request for mediation. Filed through the county's small claims dispute process, it sought damages for emotional distress, venue disruption, and reputational harm. The total listed demand was absurd, north of $200,000. But the real cost wasn't in the sum. It was in the process. Grace would be required to attend hearings, submit statements, review counterclaims, spend weeks tethered to paperwork instead of tending her spring planting schedule. And that was the point. She wasn't meant to lose in court. She was meant to lose time, focus, and momentum. Grace met with her lawyer again. He laid out the likely strategy. Drag the process until she either relented or made a mistake. "They're not trying to win," he said. "They're trying to exhaust you." "I know," she replied, "but I've been tired before. This is just another kind." But she needed help, real help, not in the form of emotional support or impassioned community rallies, but institutional backup. So she made a calculated decision and contacted the university's environmental research program, the same one she'd collaborated with years ago when they cataloged native flora across her ridgeline. She had nothing to hide and everything to gain if someone with credentials documented the ecological value of her land. Within days, 2 graduate field researchers arrived with equipment, checklists, and wide-eyed awe at the mess the mud rally had left. But beneath the surface, they confirmed what she suspected. The terrain had rapidly rebounded. Several uncommon plant species had emerged in the churn, stimulated by the disrupted soil and unusually wet spring. What had looked like destruction was, in fact, renewal. Grace provided access to the ridge, supplied maps, and explained the drainage changes she'd made over the past 2 years. They asked questions, took samples, and promised to submit their findings to the State Biodiversity Council. It wasn't a magic fix, but it created friction. If her land became a subject of ecological interest, any attempt to rezone or develop would require new studies, new permits, and new delays. Bureaucracy could work both ways. Karen's team must have sensed the shift. The mediation request was quickly amended, narrowing the complaint and removing the monetary demand. It became symbolic, an attempt to extract an apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Grace still refused, not because she was proud, but because an apology would be spun into concession, and concessions were currency in court. The public began to murmur. Nothing viral, nothing dramatic, but forums lit up. Local farmers, property owners, even a few event vendors who'd been burned by similar practices in the past started asking questions. Who had authorized the event? Who had forged the signature? Why hadn't there been an investigation? The name Karen Ellsworth began to reappear, not in wedding blogs but in landowner threads. No scandal exploded, but the air changed. Grace didn't need to win public opinion. She only needed to make aggression toward her less convenient. By the end of the month, no one had attempted to enter her land again. The lights stayed on, the water stayed clean. The quiet was real. But Grace wasn't celebrating. She knew enough about predators to understand that when they vanished, it wasn't because they'd retreated. It was because they were circling wider, looking for a better angle of attack. So she waited. She worked. And she built. Not fences or traps, but proof, presence, and pressure. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had changed. And now, she wasn't fighting from the mud. She was standing on higher ground. The first real indication that things were about to get worse came not in the form of a letter or a sudden appearance of strangers on her land, but from silence. Not just absence of noise, but a specific kind of strategic quiet that felt unnatural, deliberate, almost clinical. For nearly 2 weeks, Grace heard nothing from Karen or her representatives. No filings, no surveyors, no trucks creeping down the road at dawn. The air was too clean, like the moment before a controlled demolition. And Grace, who had learned from years of livestock, drought, and bureaucrats that nature always warns you before it bites, began preparing for something heavier, something more coordinated. She had no illusions about her adversaries. They had tried charm, then threats, then lawsuits. Now they would use something systemic, something more difficult to block with locked gates and permits. She began by digitizing everything. Scans of every filed form, every signed affidavit, all correspondence, even the photos of tire tracks and tampered gates. Her lawyer recommended archiving backups in cloud storage as well as off-site physical drives. Grace, always the kind of person who trusted a padlock more than a password, took both approaches. She built redundancy, understanding that what was coming might be aimed not at her fences, but at her credibility. And she was right. The first strike came through a call from the Agricultural Board. A calm-voiced administrator named Riley explained, almost apologetically, that a formal complaint had been lodged against Grace's operation. It cited multiple alleged violations: misuse of agricultural subsidies, failure to maintain erosion control systems, improper chemical storage near livestock zones. Riley didn't sound accusatory, just methodical, the way auditors always did when they were sent to walk through a process that had already been decided above them. Grace asked to see the complaint in full. Riley said it was internal for now, but assured her the inspection would be routine and non-punitive. That was a lie, of course. There was no such thing as a non-punitive inspection filed off an anonymous complaint. These weren't violations, they were pressure points. She didn't wait. That same day, she moved every container of pesticide or feed supplement into locked storage, mapped all her drainage lines on paper, and prepared a detailed tour script with annotations from the previous inspections. When Riley arrived 3 days later with 2 more inspectors in tow, Grace met them with a clipboard, a digital recorder, and a camera. She had learned long ago that it wasn't paranoia if it was documentation. The inspection lasted 4 hours, and though the team was cordial, their questions betrayed intent. They weren't looking for clarity. They were hoping for contradiction. 2 days later, a second call came. This time, it was from the State Water Department. Another complaint had surfaced: alleged water diversion and unsanctioned trenching near a protected drainage channel. Grace knew instantly where this came from. During the mud rally, she had redirected a runoff stream to prevent oversaturation of the lower Coop area, a completely legal, temporary measure on private land. But now it was being reframed as unauthorized modification of watershed structure. It was bureaucratic warfare, death by reinterpretation. She responded by submitting GPS data, before and after photos, and a copy of the water use rights that her father had secured 30 years earlier. Still, she knew the goal wasn't to win these complaints. The goal was to bury her in response cycles. At night, she sat at the table with a legal pad, mapping it out like a siege. First, land rights, then permits, now environmental agencies. The next likely move would be financial. And just as she anticipated, a bank letter arrived 5 days later, informing her that an external party had inquired about her loan structure and outstanding liens. That seemed innocuous. Public records allowed anyone to look. But then a second letter came, this time informing her that a lien had been placed on her property, pending resolution of a dispute filed by a vendor linked to the wedding company Karen had used. The vendor claimed breach of contract for event interference. The irony was suffocating. An event she never agreed to, blocked legally, had now looped back into a claim of interference. Her lawyer immediately moved to contest the lien, but the damage was already done. With that mark in place, banks could reevaluate her credit exposure, vendors could cancel services, and insurance policies could stall. Grace didn't panic. She adjusted. She moved her banking to a local credit union where she knew the loan officer personally. She contacted her insurance broker and added clauses covering frivolous claims. She began tracking every financial transaction manually, refusing to let a single receipt go undocumented. It was tedious. It was exhausting. But it was survival. What she didn't anticipate was the sudden arrival of a drone. It buzzed over the ridge just after dusk, quiet but present, a low hum that hovered unnervingly close to her solar panels. Grace stood on the porch and watched it. It didn't stray, didn't scout. It focused, as if collecting data. She grabbed her binoculars and caught the tail number printed on the underside of one wing. Not military, not agricultural, a private registration. She reported it to the FAA regional office. Nothing happened. The drone came back the next night, so she responded in the only way she knew how. She installed frequency jammers. Nothing commercial grade, nothing illegal, but enough to interrupt the signal range at low altitude. The next time the drone passed over, it stuttered midair, wobbled, and withdrew. The message was sent. So was another. In the midst of all this, her livestock vet was denied access to a pharmaceutical order. Apparently, her license was under review due to a flag related to property usage status. Grace traced the source to a system misclassification filed after a non-compliant parcel reassessment. A reassessment that, according to the digital log, had been submitted anonymously 2 weeks after the mud rally. It was a slow noose tightening through software. She called the university team who had surveyed her land and requested an official release of their preliminary findings. The lead researcher agreed, stating that the discovery of 2 rare pollinator plant clusters and the spontaneous resurgence of bluegrass fescue would be enough to formally classify part of the ridge as a potential conservation parcel. That classification wouldn't protect her from lawsuits, but it would trigger mandatory environmental oversight on any zoning or construction filings in the area. That meant delays, reviews, and public hearings. It was friction. And friction bought time. When the next letter came, this one from a real estate investment group expressing interest in buying her land at 3 times its appraised value, Grace understood. This was the end game. Not destruction, acquisition. They didn't want her to vanish. They wanted her to surrender. Every attack, every filing, every drone and data scrape and bureaucratic complaint had been about softening the ground, making her tired, making her doubt, making her sell. She didn't respond to the offer. She photocopied it, filed it under pressure tactics, and returned to the field. Spring had finally broken. The ridge bloomed in bursts of gold and green, and the coop was alive with sound again. Grace didn't feel victorious. She felt weathered, but there was clarity in that. A kind of stripped-down defiance that didn't roar. It endured. And endurance, she knew, was the one thing they never accounted for. It happened just before dawn. The sky was still gray with sleep, and low-hanging clouds crept over the ridge like slow smoke. Grace was up early, not from insomnia, but from habit. Her mind still tuned to a schedule that respected seasons more than clocks. She'd been checking the water troughs when she heard it. A sharp mechanical clunk followed by a low hum that didn't belong. It came from the west perimeter, near the edge of the service road where no one had reason to be. Not at this hour, and not without permission. She moved carefully across the mud-hardened pasture, keeping her steps deliberate and quiet, her boots sinking slightly with every shift. When she crested the small rise near the utility shed, she saw the lights. 2 sets of flood lamps rigged to portable stands, glowing cold and steady against the blue of the morning. In the center of the scene were 3 men, none in uniforms, moving with precision around a mounted drone rig with a scanning array aimed at her main irrigation hub. They didn't look like hobbyists or even surveyors. They looked like contractors, men hired not to ask questions but to complete a job. Grace didn't say anything. She turned and walked calmly back to the house, locked the door behind her, and called the sheriff's office. To her surprise, they came quickly. Within 30 minutes, 2 patrol trucks rolled onto the property and pulled up near the equipment. She stayed inside, watching from the kitchen window as the deputies questioned the men. She couldn't hear the exchange, but she could read the posture. One deputy annoyed, the other disengaged, the 3 men calm and unfazed. After a few minutes, the equipment was packed, the lights powered down, and the men left without incident. One of the deputies walked to her porch and knocked once. Grace opened the door but said nothing. "Private contractor," he explained. "They said they were doing terrain assessment. Had paperwork. Said they thought they were on a bordering property." "They weren't," she said flatly. "Right. We told them to clear out. If they come back, you call again." She nodded once, not in gratitude but acknowledgement, and closed the door. She already knew what this was. It was the final pass. Not an attack, but confirmation. They were logging layout data, possibly for topographical modeling, maybe even for a development overlay. It wasn't about the wedding anymore. It hadn't been for some time. That had been a diversion, a warm-up act masking a larger land play. The marriage was likely over and done. The real target was ownership, control, clearance. Everything until now had been softening her defenses. Now they were measuring for extraction. That evening, a new letter arrived, not in the mailbox, but hand-delivered and slipped into the porch screen. The envelope was thick, the paper heavier than before, and the return address bore a corporate legal group specializing in property transition mediation. The letter opened with formal language but quickly settled into a tone that was both patronizing and unmistakably final. They offered a buyout package to avoid protracted legal entanglements, citing the current market volatility, her recent pattern of combative land use decisions, and ongoing disputes that could jeopardize the long-term value of the property. The figure was substantial, far beyond what the land appraised for, but the conditions were buried in the final paragraph. Full rights transfer, immediate cessation of all agricultural use, and a permanent non-disclosure agreement. She read it twice, then folded it with care and added it to the growing archive of quiet threats disguised as opportunities. That night, Grace sat by the fireplace and stared into the coals until they dulled from orange to gray. She wasn't shaken. She was calculating. The weight of months under siege hadn't broken her, but it had refined her, hardened her sense of where the real fight lived. It wasn't about proving ownership or defending boundaries. It was about removing herself from their equation. As long as she stayed reactive, they stayed ahead. So she shifted again. No more responses. No more documentation. This time, she'd take the offensive, without stepping outside the law or giving them a moment to frame her as the problem. The next morning, she met with her lawyer. She outlined what she wanted to do, and he listened silently, brows knitted. When she finished, he sat back and said, "That's bold, risky." "It's leverage," she said. "It's noise," he corrected. "Exactly." And so it began. She filed a temporary injunction against the real estate firm for trespass and unauthorized data collection. It would likely fail, but that wasn't the point. The point was triggering a hearing, getting discovery access, forcing them to show their hand. Within days, subpoenas went out to the drone operator, the contracting firm, and the event company. And suddenly, what had been a smooth and silent operation began to stutter. Paperwork started to conflict. Records didn't match. One filing listed the target parcel as Grace's land. Another listed a placeholder tract that didn't exist. That was enough. Her lawyer requested an administrative review. He didn't expect to win. He expected delay. A full pause on any zoning action for 90 days. In that pause, Grace moved quickly. She filed for agricultural preservation status through the State Conservation Registry, citing the pollinator studies and biodiversity emergence. With it came inspections, protections, and oversight. No one could build a deck on her property now without triggering ecological review. The ridge became untouchable. They could still make noise, but they couldn't dig. The final confrontation didn't happen in court or in a field. It happened in an office, an air-conditioned, beige-walled room at the county seat where Karen Ellsworth appeared for mediation, flanked by 2 lawyers. Grace walked in alone, boots still muddy, papers tucked under one arm. Karen didn't look angry. She looked bored, like someone attending the last meeting of a project that hadn't gone her way. The mediator opened with pleasantries, then asked both parties if there was hope for resolution. Karen's lead attorney opened his folder and offered a new deal. A higher buyout, no non-disclosure, immediate payout. Grace let the silence hang for just long enough before she leaned forward and said quietly, "No." The room paused. Karen blinked. The lawyer asked, "May we ask why?" "Because I don't negotiate with people who try to take before they ask." She stood, handed the mediator a single envelope, and left. The envelope contained copies of drone registration photos, complaint timelines, permit inconsistencies, and a printed summary of her lawyer's filing trail. She didn't need to win the meeting. She just needed to make it clear that dragging this out would cost them more than giving up. When Grace walked out into the daylight, the wind picked up across the lot, dry and hot. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just kept walking. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about staying rooted. And roots didn't cheer when the storm passed. They held, and now, she knew, hers had. The summer passed quietly, and Grace understood what that meant. They had shifted their attention elsewhere. There were no more trucks idling at the edge of her property, no more paperwork arriving under vague letterheads, and no unfamiliar drones buzzing through the twilight. It didn't feel like victory. She didn't believe in that word. It felt like the kind of silence you earn after refusing to flinch for long enough. The land healed slowly. The scars from the mud rally remained carved into the earth like memory, not wounds, and in their place, wild grass took root again, reclaiming space with a slow stubbornness that mirrored her own. She focused on rebuilding, not just fences or irrigation, but rhythm. She repaired the routines that had been chipped away by court filings and inspections, returned to the business of planting, hatching, and measuring days by what bloomed rather than by what threatened. Then, in mid-August, a letter arrived, not a threat, but a formal closure. The county's mediation board declared the claims filed by the wedding vendor consortium unsubstantiated, citing lack of standing, improper jurisdiction, and procedural inconsistencies. The lien placed on her property was dismissed. Her legal fees were partially compensated through an administrative penalty imposed on the filing party. It was quiet, bureaucratic justice, not public, not triumphant, but solid enough to hold weight. She read the letter once, folded it, and placed it in the back of the cabinet with the others, not out of sentimentality, but for the same reason you keep a proof of rain, because droughts return. A few weeks later, the university team returned, unprompted. They asked permission to continue seasonal monitoring of the ridge, citing the long-term value of tracking how native plant life responded to non-traditional soil disruption. Grace agreed without hesitation. She didn't care about recognition or footnotes in an academic journal, but she understood the value of presence, of making the land a place someone else also had reason to protect. When they left, they gave her a framed certificate. Field of Biodiversity Interest, Preliminary Protection Class. She didn't hang it. She tucked it behind the pantry door where only she could see it. It wasn't for display. It was armor. Word of what had happened began to circulate beyond the county, not in headlines or outrage, but in whispers among ranchers, landowners, and contractors. Grace received 2 letters from people she didn't know, both women, who had been approached under similar pretenses about renting their land for private occasions. One had said yes and regretted it. The other had declined and was now under zoning review. Grace responded plainly, shared what she'd done, what it had cost her, and what she would not change. She didn't give advice. She gave facts. Let the rest decide for themselves. In early September, she began preparing for another event. Not a protest, not a rally, but something simpler. She reached out to a handful of those who had shown up for the mud run. Not the loudest voices, but the ones who'd helped haul trash, repair fencing, and tow rigs out of deep ruts. She asked if they'd come again. This time not for spectacle, but for celebration. They said yes. Word spread quietly. The invite was the same. Bring your own tires, your own water, your own food. No speeches, no flyers. Just dirt, wheels, and space to breathe. When the trucks arrived again in early October, the land was ready. It wasn't pristine, it was alive. The tracks from last time had become part of the terrain. This time, Grace didn't stay on the porch. She moved among them, pointed out routes, joked about ruts, handed out maps she'd drawn by hand on butcher paper. Someone offered her a custom mud flag that read, "No trespassing, no permission, no pretense." And she tied it to a fence post near the west gate. That night, when the engines had cooled and the dust had settled into dusk, Grace walked the ridge alone. The wind carried the sound of laughter from below. She looked out across the field, at the shapes of tents, headlights, and the faint gleam of chrome under moonlight. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about reclaiming the space. Not just the land, but the right to define how it lived. Her land wasn't a brand. It wasn't a venue. It wasn't for sale. It was, and always had been, a place for roots. Not roses in glass vases, but wild ones, thorned and low and stubborn as hell. She sat down at the edge of the ridge, pulled her jacket tighter against the wind, and closed her eyes. There were no more letters, no more fines, no more apologies to swallow or threats to parry. Just the weight of the air, the smell of soil, and the cold satisfaction of knowing they had tried everything and failed. In the morning, she would wake, walk the perimeter, feed the hens, and continue as before. Not because nothing had changed, but because she had chosen not to be changed by them. They had come with flowers and silver-tipped pens and deeds wrapped in velvet. She had answered with mud and memory and law. And the land, her land, had answered back.